Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. Our guest today has written that it's easy to imagine a time when race won't matter. Maybe within a half an hour he can get us there too, but first we're going to have to look at how communities used to relate, how we got trapped into our current mindset, and how we can be freed to connect with each other on deeper grounds than the color of our skin. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Willie Jennings, Associate Professor of Theology and Black Church Studies at Duke Divinity School, and author of The Christian Imagination, Theology, and the Origins of Race. Welcome, Willie.
Glad to be here with you.
Didn't really expect a book about Christianity to refer so much to place and land and animals, but that kind of proves your point that we're disconnected from our roots.
Yeah, that's correct. I think Christians confess a doctrine of creation. I don't think we actually function inside of a doctrine of creation.
You've actually called this a revolt against creation.
In many ways it is. For many centuries, we have been taught to think of our bodies in many ways separate from the earth. And the result of that is a vision of creation that really does not take into account our connectedness, our relationality to the world.
So when you begin to talk that way, I think immediately of Native American culture, but what you're really saying is this was a universal vision for a long time.
Well, in Native American culture, especially as we've experienced it here in this country, it's probably the one symbol of people struggling to keep this kind of connectedness. It comes down to us often in kind of vulgarized, very simple-minded ways of thinking about it. People call themselves little bear or big bear. But what's behind that is really a larger idea, a larger ecology, if you will, of connectedness. The lives of animals and their lives were intertwined in ways that mutually shaped intelligibility and understanding.
So that's interesting because I'm thinking about surnames, and people's last names maybe are now our only connection to sort of our heritage of whether it's the land we were from or the occupation that our forefathers had, or, as you say, animals. And yet I know a lot of my students don't even know what their last names mean or where they came from.
Well, that's an interesting development. As I try to say in the book, all of this is tied to the rise of the way people see themselves racially. And this is always one of the difficulties with people who write about the history of race or the origin of race. They don't think about it in relationship to land and place. And so in order to understand why race makes so much sense, we also have to understand why the way we look at the land has become such a natural way to look at the land. And how do we look at the land? The land is basically private property. It's inert, it's dirt, it's undeveloped, it could be developed, it could be anything, but its actual connection to our bodies. We don't imagine an actual connection. We don't imagine an actual connection to animals. Probably the closest slight sense of connection that we have are people's deep love for certain animals, like dogs or cats, how people imagine themselves with their animals as a part of the family. Now that in microcosm is just, in a way, a small analogy of a larger sense of connectedness that people once had, many peoples once had.
So what does that have to do with race?
Race is developed at the same time that another very powerful idea is developed, especially in America, and that is the idea of private property. The idea that one can own the land, that the land in and of itself really says nothing. The land does not speak. The land does not gesture. It is just there to be developed. Now, there's a long history of development of private property, but what most people don't understand is that that long history of development of private property, of property as inert, as something in potential that can be developed, runs not only alongside, but mutually shapes the rise of race. Race in and of itself is a complicated idea, but the way I try to talk about in the book really functions at three levels. What we've been talking about is the first level. Its connection to how people are pulled from the land as any part of an identifier. And the land is separated in terms of the way we imagine people. People are just beings that move on top of the land, beings that move alongside animals, but not really connected. So they can be understood, they can be defined, they can be, in a sense, discerned simply as creatures moving apart from the land. So that's at one level. At another level, it has to do with Europeans coming to the New World and in a moment of unprecedented power, able to designate and redesignate people in relationship to racial categories.
You're talking about slavery there?
Well,
moving people?
slavery comes later. It's at first simply a matter of being able to see people and compare them to other people. Take, for example, Christopher Columbus. He comes and he sees people and he compares them to the peoples he has seen in other parts of the world. It's a comparative look. And in that way, he needs some way to describe this. Well, what would be the point of reference? Obviously himself. But that point of reference takes use of some basic ideas that existed in the old world that weren't really hard and fast ideas, but were ready to become something else. The ideas that we would later on call race. So he would say, some of these people are light like us. He uses the word white like us. Others are not quite as white. Others are like the African, black. Now, at one level, that's a harmless descriptor, but it's at the threshold of doing some really important work.
So that becomes the important definer for who people are instead of the place where they live or the place that they come from.
Right. The place where they live, the place where they come from, the animals that they're connected to, those things are inconsequential.
So you're making a distinction between race and ethnicity as a defining concept.
I always like to say it's best, if you want to understand this, is to try to capture the history of its emergence and its growth, which is different from the ideas of ethnicity and culture. Often people use those words interchangeably, and it becomes really complicated because people, when they're talking about ethnicity, they're actually thinking about race, or when they're talking about race, they're actually thinking about culture. And so I think probably the most important thing for people to understand is that the idea of race emerges out of a particular moment in history. It's not natural.
So race as a concept is built entirely on stereotyping, right? I mean,
well, it's built entirely on a very slow but deliberate process of trying to name, understand, and claim the world, right? Mm-hmm. It's built upon an interesting, well, like what we like to say, a perfect storm, if you will, of people coming to a new place, realizing their power, realizing that they are in the position to now narrate what's going on, and then having the power to invite everyone else inside that particular way of seeing.
So in controlling that narrative, we categorize as a way of making sense of our world. So in choosing to categorize people by, say, skin color rather than occupation or where they live, that's where this becomes a power thing that designates identity.
Look at it this way. Europeans came to the New World, and they were trying to make sense of it. Mm-hmm. Imagine coming to a place that, first of all, you didn't realize it existed in the way it exists. I mean, so that strikes you. Wow. The landscape is foreign. That strikes you. The animals are foreign. Wow. That strikes you. And there are peoples. They look alike, but they look differently. And then you start to discern that their language first is not like your language. Okay, that's new. But then there are differences in the languages you are seeing. And there's multiple languages, multiple ways of life. And so in the midst of all that, you want to take hold of things that can help you make sense of it.
Mm-hmm. Sure, right, yeah.
And so racial categorization comes out of the effort to try to make sense of a world that is now in front of you. But here's the other part. Also a world that you have the power to take at the same time. So the difficulty is race emerges out of both those things. One is almost a reality of weakness, of trying to make sense, and the other is a reality of power, taking hold of what you see. And so you put both those things together, right? And, you know, it becomes the fertilizer that creates this new way of seeing the world.
Now, backing up, in the earliest days of Christianity, for instance, when someone was relocated, they were enfolded into a new culture. They were brought in and inculcated into new practices and traditions and so forth. But they became part of that community regardless of how they looked. But now we see a shift with Columbus and with other colonizers. And so how does the church take part in that shift?
Well, there's a story of gentile inclusion. How those of us who were not of Israel entered into a story that was not ours, and it became ours. Well, that's a beautiful drama in Scripture. And in point of fact, it's the drama that is at the heart of our Christian identity, that we were included in. Well, inclusion is a thorny idea, because it means that you came to something that wasn't yours, right? And that certain things had to happen in the drama of history that allowed you to come in. Now, ultimately, the story says you were imagined as a part of it, but it's still inclusion. Well, in a strange way to make a complicated story simple, Christians slowly but surely got very tired of the story of inclusion. You know, it's like you're the person who marries into the family, and they continue to remind you, you married into this family. You know that, right? Christians slowly but surely got tired of that story and began to imagine the story of Christianity as though they were the central concern. And Israel, the children of Israel, Jewish people, were those who were being brought in to them. Now, in theological language, we call that supersessionism, the idea that Christians superseded, replaced, pushed aside, became the new and improved people of God.
And so then they put themselves at the center of this whole story.
They put themselves at the center, and that's a major problem. It continues to be a major problem in the way many Christians understand their faith and life. We don't even read the Bible as though we are Gentiles.
And I see where you're going here. If
Right.
I'm a missionary,
Yes.
and I'm going to come and get you and bring you into my world as I see it, as defined by my terms.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So, now, that development, by the time we come to the 14th, 15th century, that development has made the church the kind of institution that imagines itself the central font of salvation, and everyone must be brought into its story. Now, when you put that strange development next to a church coming to the new world in absolute power, those two things coming together constitute part of a perfect storm. What does it mean? It means that Christians don't come imagining that they should enter the lives and the worlds of others. They come imagining that we're going to bring you into our world, i.e. civilization. Now, simply put, that's backwards. That's fundamentally backwards in the way a Christian ought to imagine their life in the world.
But how do you separate the theology from the other cultural manifestations of who we are?
Well, and this is always the crucial problem. How does one offer what one has to another people? Well, in truth, if you come to another people, the first way one offers is to receive, right? What do I mean by that? You offer yourself. This is in many ways the logic of the incarnation, of God becoming flesh. To offer to us the divine life, God enters creaturely life, right?
And listens to us and walks alongside us.
Not simply listens to us and walks alongside us, but in a sense, what the multiple traditions of the church said in many ways is that the Creator takes hold of the creature, brings the creaturely reality to the divine life, into the divine life, right? So, by much lesser analogy, we enter into the lives of others, not as a missiological ploy, but this is about loving people, right? The stories that most Christians don't know about, which I wish we did, but there's not many books about this in the history of theology or in theological institutions or Christian colleges these days, are the stories of those missionaries who went, as we used to say, went native. Those people who realized that if they were actually going to present Christ, be Christian, they would have to be Christ showing love and desire for people. That is, becoming, by expansion, not denying who they are, but expanding who they are, right?
That's a scary thing to do.
Oh, it's more than scary.
What if you lose yourself?
Well, this is always the thing. If we follow the analogy of our Savior, if we follow the analogy that's at the heart of Christianity, at no point in his life does Jesus stop being God. The difficulty for us is that we imagine the loss. But now, here we have to always think from the side of the indigenous peoples, the natives, the peoples who are at home in the New World. The challenge of adapting, being malleable, being open, fell on them. They were the ones that had to try to figure out how to remain true to what they could remain true to while receiving, or in many ways, having pressed down their throat, a Christianity bathed in a certain kind of civilization, a certain kind of cultural hegemony, as we say. So they had to figure a way out, how can I remain in any way, shape, or form who I am, given what's being pressed upon them? And that in and of itself is a drama of Christianity. The other idea I talk about in the book, which is a equally complicated idea, but it's an important idea, is to try to show how Christianity in the West, in the Western world, has been so wedded to an idea called whiteness. And whiteness is a complicated idea because it is a part of race. Often when people think about race, they think about non-white peoples. And
I don't think about being white unless I'm thinking about race.
Right. And like a colleague of mine who says that when people think about gender, they only think about women. They don't think about that about gender.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the difficulty with thinking about race and thinking about whiteness as a part of race is that whiteness has two elements to it, two fundamental elements. Whiteness is like those who stand behind the camera and the camera itself. It allows you to see particular angles. Now, when you talk about race, because it is that, the camera is only pointed at those who have been racialized, identified as a race.
You wrote in the book, without place as the articulator of identity, human skin was asked to fly solo and speak for itself.
Absolutely.
A recent guest, Elijah Anderson, says essentially the same thing, that color becomes this, the only biography people think they need, when in fact it's completely inadequate.
It's the only way in which we identify creation now.
Yeah.
Which is absurd, right? We don't identify landscape or animals or rivers or seasons as somehow constitutive of our identities, which is an odd thing for a Christian who says they believe in creation.
But we also move around so much, it's maybe hard to be tied to a place.
Mobility is at a different level. People who historically have identified with place, they were mobile, they were nomads. The point is not place as we understand it, sequestered blocks of land that we call private property. It might be a particular region. The points that coordinate that region would be a particular mountain, rivers, animals, and seasons. And so people living in this area identify with it. There's an anthropologist named Keith Basso who spent time among the Apache, and he tells the story of how the Apache have an ethical system that is shaped by place names, that's shaped by places. Places help them imagine their ethical responsibilities, just simply by being
Could you give me an
connected to
example?
place. Well, he tells a great story of someone who lived among his people in Arizona and then moved to Southern California. And he tells a story that this young man fell into all kind of difficulty. He kind of lost his moral compass. And when he came back home, his own story was, I was away from the places, and I really didn't know who I was. And I didn't have the stories that are tied to the places that remind me of how I should behave, how I should act, how I should respond to the world.
That makes sense to me. Your book is primarily history of how the church has kind of lost its way in seeing the world this way, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about the present and the future and how we fix what's broken here.
The first thing is that churches, Christians, ought to think very seriously about place. And what I mean by that is churches ought to ask, why are we here? That is not why are we
Why do we exist? But yeah, why are we on this block in this
right,
building?
but why is this church on this block, in this building? What's our purpose here? And to think about it. Most churches never even ask that question. The second, a church ought to ask itself, does it have an obligation to life in that place?
Do you know, the church that I grew up in is a downtown church that is slowly dying out, and they're beginning to look at alternative uses for that space as a place of ministry. It's in a downtown place, and they're beginning to realize that its future may not lie in Sunday worship at all, but that it might be that their service as the church has a very different outlook, whether that be a daycare center or homeless pantries or whatever. And I think there are churches that are beginning to look around and say, how do we serve our community? But I would have to agree with you that we're sort of, and I think you described them as floating islands for the past many, many years.
I think I always say that's a great start for churches. The people in any local church ought to sit together and prayerfully ask themselves the question, why do we live where we live? And here, the crucial matter is for a church not to simply follow the smooth flow of real estate and the calculations of developers and real estate people. Not to demonize them, but to simply say churches have a theological responsibility. Or should I say, the people of any church have a theological responsibility to prayerfully ask, why are we living where we live? And what is the relationship between where we live and this church? And to face a very serious question, should we live where we live?
So what you're saying is the church needs to be more than where the building is,
That is
but
so
it's where the
true.
congregation exists as well.
Race continues to be energized by the formation of space. At a simple level, we know this, segregated communities. And segregated communities continue to be a problem because segregated communities shape what we imagine and what we dream, right? They shape who we imagine we ought to be related to. They shape the reach of our imaginative range for relationship. And so churches can't sit back and say, well, get the best house you can in the best neighborhood you can. That's all that's required of you. Unfortunately, I think I dare say most churches and most pastors are yet to understand that their discipleship is really shaped by this. And even if you have an orthodox, serious vision of church, of sacraments, of an ecclesiology, as we say, a robust ecclesiology, if you really don't think about place, you really aren't very serious about any of that.
Can you tell me a story about one church you know who's moving in the right direction with this, or a place that we can look for hope and inspiration?
Well, that's always a good question. I really never give people examples because, not because I don't know a few, but I always ask people to do something else first. And that is to look inside their churches at people who in their own lives are already doing things like this. I'll give you one example. There is one church in a particular city in the United States that I've been to where the neighborhood changed. They stayed because they wanted to be one with their neighbors. And they became the anchors of the church that was coming. It was a very different church. And when people asked them, why'd you stay? They never gave, well, it's the Christian thing to do, or, we couldn't get out, we didn't have enough money.
They were happy.
They said they were happy, and they said, we like our neighbors. In fact, we love our neighbors, and we want to continue to be a part of their lives. Now, my simple point is that that's at the heart. That's at the heart of what it means to be a Christian.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. So happy to talk with you. My guest today has been Willie Jennings of Duke Divinity School and author of The Christian Imagination, Theology, and the Origins of Race. I'm Karen Saupe. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.